Hello, we are live on University Radio Nottingham. This is The Big Picture with Felix Hawes. Joining us today is Titus.
Hello.
Josh.
Hello, Felix.
And Daniel.
Good afternoon, Felix.
Good afternoon, Daniel. Well, isn't it good to be back? And it's what a shame there's not been much in the news to discuss. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the absolute turmoil that is taking over the government. We will be discussing the Iran protests, and we will be discussing John Cleese of Monty Python fame getting a new show on GB News. So first of all, let's discuss the turmoil that is facing the government. Well, we have a new Prime Minister that was installed over the summer, because when we last were on The Big Picture, Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, and Liz Truss has had quite a torrid time, really. And yesterday, her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, was sacked, and Jeremy Hunt, who I'm sure is someone Daniel loves, is the new Chancellor. So we've got lots to discuss here, lots of pointers. I want to actually begin, before we talk about the collapse of the government and its support in the polls, I want to talk about the mini-budget, which was the source of this turmoil to begin with. So there was a series of measures that were announced, and most notably the two that we've witnessed U-turns on are the 45p reduction for the highest earners, the additional rate tax, which was introduced by David Cameron. So the tax rate will be, they were suggesting the tax rate for the highest earners should be lowered to what it was under Gordon Brown. That has been U-turned. As has recently the corporation tax hike, which is going to be going up to 25%, which was what Rishi Sunak wanted to do. And bearing in mind, this will mean that the corporation tax of 25% will be double, pretty much double, Ireland, our nearest neighbour to the west. Basically then, is Trussonomics dead in the water? And what do you think about this budget that the markets reacted so terribly to because it was unfunded? And let's also bear in mind to Josh, who is potentially the most natural Tory critic of the panel today, there's obviously comments that this was unfunded and a lot of mention of the 45 billion unfunded tax cuts. But what about the 200 billion unfunded energy handouts to help people over the coming winter with their energy bills increased? Who wants to begin? We're focusing on the mini budget itself, then we'll move on to the bigger picture, as this is the big picture link. Okay, who wants to go first? Josh, go on.
Can do. So, as you said, Felix, we've in this really unprecedented situation where a Prime Minister, through announcing their policies, has sparked this economic crisis, which the Bank of England has had to react to. Just take a moment to comprehend that. The Bank of England is quite what's the word? Measured organisations, shall we say. They don't leap into intervention. They've done it twice before. They've done it with the financial crisis in 2008. They made huge interventions. And they did it during COVID with the global pandemic. So this will be the first time that the Bank of England has had to intervene to deal with a crisis caused by the government itself.
Well,
Daniel's shaking his head.
That's
Daniel.
just not true, is it? I mean, the Bank of England's only been independent since, 1997? And the fact is, part of the reason why we had a market turmoil at the result of the mini-budget was because the Bank of England didn't raise interest rates high enough, which wouldn't have happened if the government controlled it. I mean, if you'd gone back to, say, 1993, where you had the sterling turmoil and interest rate turmoil as a result of us joining the European, or ERM, then you'd have said the Bank of England had to step in, but it couldn't because it was part of the government.
I'd just like to pull you up on that, Daniel, because I think that the point about the government, the Bank of England being independent from the government, which restricted their knowledge of it, that shouldn't have been the case. The part of the reason for the economic turmoil caused by this mini-budget is not as much the policies, although there are significant problems with them. It's as much about how Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng went about announcing this and bringing it to the table. They did not discuss it with their cabinet. They did not do any financial analysis by the OBR or any. They didn't have economists analyse their plans. They gave rough estimates which people did not think were credible. They didn't communicate with the Bank of England, and they fired their chief economist, who the chief secretary to the Treasury, who had decades of experience, and so they launched into this in a matter of weeks, and they did not communicate with the relevant financial institutions in Britain what the consequence of their plans were likely to be, and they didn't communicate well with the Bank of England, and so it's the execution as much as the policies.
What do you think would be a bigger reason for the pound falling compared to the dollar? The fact that interest rates at the Bank of England was raised far slower than it was in the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, or the fact that you've brought in tax cuts? I mean, which is it? It's obviously the former.
So do you think that, Daniel, now that economic plans have changed under the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, or de facto Prime Minister...
changing already, weren't they, under Quarting?
Do you think that the markets are going to react more kindly to that? And if so, would that suggest that the government's policy is more...
I don't think the government should do its policy based on how they think the markets should will react in a short-term sense. It should be based on long-term decision-making, not short-term. In the next few days the markets aren't going to be very happy. I'm sorry. I mean, let's say for instance, to give an example, right? We have had interest rates set at about 1% for the past 12 years. Well, in the short term, you raise interest rates, it's terrible, isn't it? Mortgages go up, but it's needed in the long term to combat this thing.
Right,
I mean, how do you base your economic policy?
The Bank of England, one of the reasons they had to raise interest rates was because, whilst people think that raising interest rates is a good thing for pension funds also hedge against raising interest rates, and they need more capital. One of the reasons the Bank of England intervened in the first place was because they were afraid pension funds weren't going to be able to make up the necessary capital.
Daniel, in terms of government policy, not thinking about the short term, it does remind me of the classic chant: "What do we want? Growth. When do we want it? Medium to long term future." It's I think it's certainly interesting, isn't it, to see the Conservative Party that is normally regarded as the party of economic competence to now be considered to be dramatically behind Labour in that field. Now, it's important to note, though, of course, that the Labour Party actually backed most of the mini-budget, including the reversal of the national insurance hike that Rishi Sunak put in place, and they also backed the cut of the lowest rate of income tax on the basic rate from 20 to 19%. So actually, a lot of the problems that faced the previous budget, the Labour Party would have had as well. But it seems that Trussonomics, as it was dubbed, is dead in the water, because Jeremy Hunt is now saying that we will not be borrowing to achieve our tax cuts. In fact, taxes might increase even further. They're already the highest they've been since the Second World War. And he's also said that cuts to public spending might also have to occur, austerity 2.0. Do you think Jeremy Hunt is now running the government?
I mean, he's only been in there for a day, so it'd be very impressive if that was the case, Felix.
I don't think anyone's running the government, Felix.
Larry the cat is running the government.
I mean, perhaps so. I mean, but you kind of... Yeah, this was more response to your earlier question. Is Trussonomics doomed? I mean, it is. If you said to me 2 days ago, is there a Trussonomics? I might have said yes, but it's not looking very good. Now there can't be. And the thing that particularly shocks me is that, a week ago I could have said, yes, Truss is divisive. Yes, she's done a gambling budget, but at least she's going to have the support of low tax Conservatives. Now low tax Conservatives can't support her because she's done not just a minor U-turn, major U-turns, and not even One Nation Conservatives can support her because she apparently claims she's a low tax Conservative. So who can support her now?
I think Truss has made a spectacular mess of this situation. She's managed to burn almost every bridge that she had, and yet she didn't have the political authority in the bank that Johnson had from his election victory. She has made herself very unpopular with the people that voted her in, because she is completely reneged on her promises. They voted for Liz Truss because she promised tax cuts and a narrative of optimism, unlike Rishi Sunak. But now they, after a month, have got Rishi Sunak's policies and his pessimism, but without Rishi Sunak. She has also managed to... she never really had the support of her parliamentary party. They primarily backed Rishi Sunak, so they're not inclined to support her. The general public didn't necessarily buy her policies, and now they're never going to, because they're not going to be carried out, and they're just going to see a U-turn and someone who has folded after a month. So she's in an incredibly weak position, and she has managed to make a spectacular bungle of this. She has nowhere to really turn. Boris, when he was under pressure, was able to say to people, look, I delivered a historic majority, and so you should stick with me because I can win elections. Liz Truss hasn't done that, and what's more, she has very little charisma. She is fairly wooden, and so I think that it's going to be difficult to see how she's going to turn this around. She has caved on her sort of landmark policies. The Tories will now, or are, looking for damage mitigation. So who knows what they'll go with in the coming months.
Do you think the sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng as the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the first time the Chancellor has been sacked for agreeing with the Prime Minister? I mean, that is an interesting turn. I think that Kwasi Kwarteng was quite popular with the backbenchers, and as you were saying, Liz Truss has alienated everybody. I mean, her supporters are not big fans of Jeremy Hunt at all. Let's not forget, Jeremy Hunt was the first person to be eliminated in the most recent leadership election, and now he probably holds the most powerful tool. He went on the Today programme, and I don't think he uttered a single phrase or offer of assurance that he was confident in Liz Truss's leadership. Well, it's interesting. Of course, we've had 4 chancellors this year. That's more chancellors than Labour have had since 1967.
We've also had 4 chancellors in the last 4 months.
4 months. Yeah, so I wonder who November's chancellor's going to be. Larry the Cat, Boris Johnson, maybe Jeremy Corbyn. So Liz Truss, well, how did she get into this office? Well, she obviously got in because Boris Johnson had resigned. But her opinion polling is far lower than anything Boris Johnson ever got. She has 9% approval rating according to most recent polls, a net approval rating of -47 by Opium polls, which is the lowest they've ever recorded for any Prime Minister in history. And only a quarter of people that vote for Brexit now are wanting to back the Conservative Party. The 2019 coalition of voters that Boris Johnson's leadership managed to procure together is now looking like it's fallen apart. Do you think that the Red Wall voters are ever going to come back to the Conservative Party now after they've made what most people would deem such a hash of an 80-seat majority, the largest majority that the Conservatives have seen since 1987 with Margaret Thatcher?
People have short memories, so never say never, but I certainly don't think there'll be a huge turnout for the Conservative Party in Red Wall seats this election.
Daniel?
Look, I gave a speech about a week ago at a fantastic event called Port and Policy.
Oh, yes.
Where I argued that Liz Truss was not doomed because, Thatcher was in a similar position in 1981 with polling about as bad as Truss is in.
Thatcher won elections.
And a similar economic scenario, and everyone thought she was dead in the water. But here's the thing, I don't think being unpopular means you're doomed. Like, we know that polls can change, but we know you have to be unpopular for a reason. And that's the thing. And at that speech, I said she's unpopular because she's sticking with a tough, low-tax economic plan. And now she's unpopular for no reason whatsoever. And that is not what Thatcher had. So from that basis, yes, I think the Red Wall will ditch her.
Daniel, she is unpopular for a reason, and the reasons why she's unpopular with her opponents remain the same, but now what she has done is alienated her supporters. She is unpopular with them as well because she has not shown a backbone, she has not stood up for what she believes in, the main pillar of what she believes in. She's not stood up for it, but she is also the thing that she believes in. People don't like, and the people are going to feel betrayed. So people who don't agree with her can't respect her, like maybe some did with Thatcher, and people who do agree with her are disappointed because she has not delivered for them.
So where next for the Conservative Party? Pretend you are a Conservative MP. Josh, I know that's the hardest for you. But pretend you're one. What do? Do you get rid of Liz Truss? And the Tory party looks like we're in Italy and replacing prime ministers regularly. But or would you take the opinion that it's so bad right now, things actually can't get worse when you're polling at the low 20% and the Labour Party are 30 points ahead? Do you replace them with a unifying candidate, which is being suggested? Would that be Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, very popular amongst the Tory backbenchers and the membership? Would that be Jeremy Hunt, less popular? Or Rishi Sunak, who, of course, many of his economic predictions have come true? What would you do?
You can't. I don't think you can replace Liz Truss. As much as I thought she should have stuck with her guns after that mini budget, you can't get rid of her after having a leadership contest that lasted 6 weeks. You're just going to make the situation worse. I'm sorry, but that's the case. You've got to change how you elect leaders. The way that Hay changed it.
How about through a general election? That'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
But that's not going to suit a Tory MP, and unfortunately, that's how.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I took off my Tory MP thing.
Yeah, Josh, you're a Tory MP.
Well, if you have elections all the time, whenever a leader's unpopular, then you're not going to get particularly good policies passed by government. So it's not always good to go for general elections in these situations. But so I guess I don't have a good answer. There is no good answer now that Truss has.
It's just doomed all around.
I think that.
Seemingly.
I think that the idea that things can't get any worse is always foolish. I think things can always get worse. There is, you may not be able to conceive of it now, but there is always a path to greater doom, even if it's not always likely. But I think that if the Conservative Party were to ditch Liz Truss as well and bring in a fourth Prime Minister, which has not entered office through an election, they would go from being a party which is deeply unpopular because they have a terrible Prime Minister to a party that is no longer taken seriously and is seen as simply unfit to be near government. Yeah. They are already under a lot of criticism. I think if they were to remove Liz Truss after a couple of months, they are admitting that they can't make a good decision about who can run the country. And if Liz Truss is to lead them into the election, it's likely she'll lose. If they were to remove Liz Truss and then after several months and then go into the election, I think there's a greater risk they lose at the next election and the election after that and the election after that. So the Conservatives need to look at it as from the perspective of the next election is highly likely to be lost. How can we then remake ourselves at the election after that? And I think you have to leave Liz Truss in place, let her get beaten, and then have a fresh start, rather than keep bungling the time in government. There aren't any natural people to take over. There's no one who you'd go, oh yes, they would make a great leader. Yeah. They can always make hash of it again.
Go on, Josh. Tory MP Josh Wright.
Tory MP Josh Wright. Great leader still may be a stretch, but Rishi Sunak predicted pretty much everything which was going to happen during the Conservative leadership campaign. And in a sense, he's been very much vindicated. It's just that the Conservative MPs, for the most part, don't seem to like him. He's not very popular amongst them.
No, he is popular among the MPs. He was the most popular among the MPs. It was the members
who don't like him. But also, I can't see the party coming together around him.
No,
because he stabbed Boris Johnson in the back.
I think they would have to then admit that their process for electing a leader is wrong, and they would have to change that and not change it back. You can't go through a process, allow the members to choose, and then after a couple of months say that's a bad choice, and still retain faith in the system that elected that leader.
Well, whenever you have a Prime Minister of any party or a leader of any party that the members back but the MPs don't, things go terribly wrong for them. I mean, look at Ian Duncan Smith. Yep. The MPs there backed Kenneth Clarke, and Ian Duncan Smith's tenure was short-lived. Of course, more recently on the other side, Jeremy Corbyn had the support of something like 16 MPs of the Labour Party, so not a lot, and that caused them an awful lot of problems. But the thing is, what you were saying, Titus, about the likelihood of the Conservatives losing the next election, considering the fact that they were about 20 points ahead of the Labour Party 2 years ago in the polls, and they've had a historic victory, the things were looking bright for them before, and it's just gone so wrong within 1 year. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Liz Truss's opinion polling is worse than Boris Johnson, even at the height of Partygate. Do you think the Conservative Party made the right decision to get rid of Boris Johnson?
Yes. I will say that I thought they made the right decision, and it was partly because you had Partygate. The bigger reason was that he didn't stand for anything. The only reason he was Prime Minister was to deliver Brexit. After that, there's no real evidence of his conservatism. There's no evidence of a political philosophy. There's no evidence of principles. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a pragmatic Prime Minister. I mean, Liz Truss is very much showing that sort of idea now, isn't he? But he didn't have any reason for being there, and so it was right he had to go, and you could kind of see that, and he was just throwing out scraps of red meat, hoping that they would somehow pick up in the polls, and they weren't, and rightly so. So it was time he was replaced. Now, I was someone who was hoping that Kemi Badenoch would become Prime Minister or something like that. Anyway, we went for Liz Truss, but we would be in a similar position now if Boris Johnson was leader.
I think it was also right. I'd agree with you, Daniel, to get rid of Boris Johnson. If the Conservative Party wants to claim that it is serious about issues of morality in any sense, then they have to uphold those standards. And Boris Johnson manifestly did not. And as he continued to break those ethical norms, they had to react. Additionally, he didn't seem to stand for anything or even be able to pass anything because of the continuing scandals. So despite winning a historic majority, he was not able to really use it because scandal after scandal dominated the politics of the party. I think the main mistake they made was the Conservative Party was not electing Rishi Sunak. He had elements of charisma, obviously not on the same level as some other politicians, but he was also a capable politician, and he was serious. He faced up to the issues
The MPs put the wrong people through to the final two. But if I may just say, I think we're touching on a deeper problem here, that in politics, at least for the last 20 years, there has been a decline in the amount of prime ministerial MPs that are in Parliament. I mean, if you'd said in the 80s, Thatcher's to go, who's to replace her, you could probably name half a dozen people who would be prime ministerial material. And the fact that now we're scrapping about for names, and it's the same for Labour in the 70s, shows a real shift of the type of people we're getting as politicians.
Josh, what do you make about Boris Johnson? I know you're not a fan, but you're not a fan of Liz Truss.
I was going to say, feel we've got unanimity on the panel. How exciting is that everyone here thinks, well, I can't speak for you, Felix.
Oh, yeah, impartial, completely impartial.
Yeah. But everyone here thinks Boris Johnson, it was right for him to go. I'm with Titus from a far more ethical point of view, that an MP like that who has consistently lied to the public with the Partygate scandal and many other things which I would argue are more significant but got less press coverage, he just had to go. They've totally messed up who they've replaced him with, and it's a bit of a disaster. But
okay, final question on this topic, thank you Josh, is what do you think will happen? You've all said that getting rid of Liz Truss might not be great for the Conservative Party, but what do you think actually will happen? How long has she got?
She'll be gone by Christmas.
Daily Star are doing a live feed of her and a lettuce, or is it a cabbage, and seeing a wet lettuce, that's it, and to see which one is going to last longer. So do tune into that if you're interested. So Josh, you think by Christmas she's going to be gone?
I do. I don't know who will replace her. That's the one thing which is holding me up. But the Conservative Party is ruthless when it comes to winning elections, and they'll oust anyone who's going to stop them in their path. And at the minute, Liz Truss isn't winning them any points. I don't know who they're going to find as the unity candidate. You listed Ben Wallace, which is interesting. He didn't run in the Conservative leadership election last time. Maybe the dire state of the party might motivate him this time. I'm as the person to be coronated. You didn't mention Penny Mordaunt, which I thought potentially had a chance.
There is an idea that she might. The Times is reporting that there are some MPs that want Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt to run on a joint ticket, but I'm sure that will please Daniel. Daniel and Titus, what do you think then to what is going to happen? How long has this trust got? Will she remain in place until the next election?
I kind of think the most optimistic outlook you can take is that these tax rises help stem inflation, and then come early in the new year, Truss is able to bring along some of these tax cuts, and the economy. You have a mild winter, lots of wind as well. So
can I ask how
the energy is able to stay up to demand? Yes, Josh.
As someone who has an understanding of Liz Truss, as I don't, how was her tax cuts ever going to stem the tide of inflation? If anything, they're surely more inflationary by putting more money in the economy.
Her policy was that the worst thing that could happen is a recession. If you starve off a recession, it's worth perhaps slightly worse inflation rates.
Which incidentally is the opposite of Thatcher's. Thatcher arguably helped to cause a recession in order to tackle inflation.
Well, and there's the case that Liz Truss was going to borrow more than Jeremy Corbyn wanted to.
Yes, but Truss's argument was that we've got the lowest debt ratio in the G7 because we've had austerity, thankfully, from 2010, so we can afford to spend. Obviously, the main reason we've got inflation is because of lockdown, which far too arduous and for far too long. anyway, this is the position we're in. I guess I disagree with Josh. I can't see Conservative MPs, after wasting 6 weeks on a leadership election, can bring themselves to replace her. I just can't. I mean, I suppose it becomes more and more possible by the day, so ask me next week. But
yeah, it might be a different story.
She's going to have to stumble on, try and get through the winter and see if she can do some of her policies she promised early next year, and we'll see where we are then.
Titus, last point, if you don't mind. What's your view? How long has Liz Truss got?
I think instinctively I'd agree with Daniel in that I'd find it hard to see the Conservative Party replacing her so soon, because it does it makes it much harder for them to be taken seriously. However, I've seen a couple of things on reported on social media or in the news by correspondents saying that the Northern MPs, a lot of the people that won seats in the Red Wall in 2019, have changed some of the dynamics in the party. They're a bit more reactive to events, and they're more eager to. They're obviously aware that their seats are under threat, and they're more eager to respond to things. Potentially also more economically less wing and less likely to support Liz Truss's tax cuts. And so I do think the complexion, the ideological spread, and the experience levels in the Parliamentary Conservative Party did change a lot in 2019 by the nature of Boris Johnson's unique coalition. And so I don't think
ousting of all the former MPs.
Exactly. So I don't think you can quite be as certain that the party is going to behave in the same way, given there are so many fresh faces that come from different traditions and are maybe tied to Boris Johnson's sort of brief realignment of politics. Certainly the coalition that he assembled, electoral coalition he assembled, was unique, and it's one of the reasons why I don't think Liz Truss will be able to win. So yes, I don't think they'll get rid of her, but I think there's added uncertainty this time compared to, say, when Theresa May was removed.
Well, thank you, Titus, and thank you to Daniel and Josh on that. Before we take a music break, I would like to remind our many, many, many listeners back home that they can message in to us, and I can read out their messages. If you are on URN on the website page, there is a link underneath that says message in, which I believe is on Discord. We've had a message so far. Excited for the start of the big picture for this year. Well, thank you. And Felix is a babe as well, so thank you very, very much to whoever said that. We're going to take a musical break. We'll be back after this break, and as we're in economic turmoil, I thought this song was appropriate.
On campus
and online. This
is
URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. We've had some more messages. I'm just going to read them out before we begin our second topic of today. Great points from Daniel, says someone. Big up Titus. In Liz, we trust. Trust the process is another word. That's trust, not trust. Very, very clever. And we've had a lovely message from our house in Beeston. Hi, Felix. We are really enjoying the show. Love Lucy, Amy, James's, plural, Ollie, and your new close friend, Simon. I met Simon yesterday. He's a top lad. And we've got a song, actually, that Amy requested that's going to come later on in the programme, so do stay tuned. But first of all, our second topic, and quite a sombre one too, as we'll be discussing the protests that have been going on in Iran. Well, as you may know, there has been some protests primarily by women after the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old who died in custody of the morality police in Iran, and she was only 22, and she had been arrested for the crime of showing her hair, which is illegal in Iran. There have been a lot of very brave protests against the supreme leader of Iran. It is a dictatorship. There is no democracy, and women's rights are very, very poor. The Iran Human Rights Group, which is a Norwegian-based humanity group, believes that 201 people have been killed, including 23 children. So, to the panel, this is obviously a very sad occasion, and it's difficult to know what we can do in the UK. So what would you suggest that the government does? Of course, Iran is already heavily sanctioned, more so because of Donald Trump withdrawing from the Iran deal. What do you think the UK government could do in this situation?
I mean, you talk about it being a sad moment, Felix. If anything, we should be very glad. This is some of the largest protests we've ever seen in Iran since, of course, the Ayatollah took over in 1979, and that's a very good thing. I mean, we know, for instance, that Iran is a supporter of Putin. I mean, we saw in the summer that fatwa that they gave to Salman Rushdie is still very much in force. So they're incredibly fundamentalist. So, we should absolutely support these women. I mean, they are, in my opinion, the real feminists. I mean, there's feminists in the United Kingdom of all sorts of stripes of colours. These guys do it properly, where it's illegal to wear your hijab even in a particular sense. To answer your question, I have a light-hearted answer to what can Britain do, and that is quite simply beat Iran in the World Cup. Because we've got them in the group stages. If we do, I mean, that would be good. But on a more serious level, we've seen James Cleverly has supported the protests, and any further sanctions would be a good thing. We've also got to say that this is another example of Trump's foreign policy being good, because of course he left the Iran nuclear deal.
Just to explain to listeners that might not know what this deal is that we're referring to, there was a deal negotiated, I believe, by the Obama administration.
Yes, in 2015.
In 2015, that basically sanctions would be lifted on Iran for as long as they do not build nuclear weapons. Donald Trump thought that was a silly deal, and he withdrew, which caused a lot of awry in the international world and criticism from, including the UK. Theresa May was the Prime Minister back then. Do you remember when she was Prime Minister? A long time ago now.
Those days.
And now, of course, sanctions are high on Iran, and I think it is one of the most sanctioned countries.
Because, of course, it makes sense that we would want to give these people nuclear weapons. What, Daniel? Seriously?
Well, no, you're ending sanctions on a country that's utterly despicable. I totally supported Trump ending the Iran nuclear deal. I think that was the right thing to do for what is. Well, I guess I wouldn't call the nation evil, but I'd say the government in Iran is evil. Weapons. Well, it's not nuclear weapons. It's to do with it's nuclear power, I believe. I think it was right to leave that deal. The Obama administration, and it was obviously signed by a lot of countries, and reduced a lot of sanctions on Iran. Iranian money that was withheld from being used by the Iranian government was said, well, you can actually have this money back now. They shouldn't have ended those sanctions, in my opinion. It's wrong to do that for such an evil government. You can see that evidence in these protests.
Titus, what do you think the UK government should do in response to the morality police, which have also been sanctioned as well by the UK?
I mean, the Iranian government has been of this character for a long time, and I think that the government can make its opposition to its conduct clear. I think that Daniel's comment about the World Cup is a good one. At significant cultural and sporting events, you can use those to peacefully and without too much fanfare protest and make clear what you believe is right.
The World Cup, which of course is being hosted in Qatar, another country that is not exactly known for strong women's rights.
It's also not known for good relations with Iran. The Shia and Sunni rivalry in the Middle East is so significant that it has led Israel to make peace and cooperation agreements with Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates. So I think that as a Western country, we can use our diplomatic influence to express and put pressure on Iran to change these laws, to stand up for what is right. But I also think we should we need to be careful about the extent to which we force countries or enforce moral standards on countries which we don't always uphold in terms of respecting international boundaries. I think with the war in Ukraine, we've obviously condemned Russia, and we've condemned that, which is absolutely right. But Tony Blair and George Bush's invasion of Iraq undermines our ability to stand as the West and say, this is right, we are standing for this because we did something that was not legal in the eyes of international law. So I think we need to be careful that we maintain our moral authority as Western countries, and we don't, and that we do respect the sovereignty of other nations, including Iran, even though we firmly disagree with what their policies are. I think we should remember that the Ayatollah was swept to power in what was a largely popular movement. Whether that is changing now, I'm unsure. But
wasn't it a coup? I mean, if I may just briefly interrupt, one of the most interesting things is that Iran, prior to that, I mean, I've called it a coup, but the Ayatollah takeover in 1979.
It was a revolution of some sort.
Yeah, it was the most Western culturally country in the Middle East. I mean, women were free to do what they like. If you look at how they...
Yeah, I think my point is exactly. I think my point is that we can't just, and we saw this in Iraq and in Iran under the Shah. You can't quite go in and impose your way of life or direct that on countries that are culturally different. Now, obviously, that's one thing, and then basic morality is another, and we should stand up for that. But I think we do need to be cautious about overextending and going beyond what is acceptable in terms of respecting sovereignty and recognizing that different countries do approach things differently. Obviously, in this case, it is a more simple moral issue.
Josh, Titus seems to be quite against liberal intervention, if I have read his points correctly. What do you think on that?
Oh, well, that's a question for you, isn't it? I don't know. Like, I'm in favour of liberal intervention, and when it's thoroughly thought out. There's too many examples where it's gone badly wrong for us to sensibly jump into these situations.
Sorry, you carry on.
I was just going to say, I think what we're doing with Ukraine at the minute's great. Giving them as much money as we can, giving them the arms they need, but letting the Ukrainians fight because it's their country, and ultimately they know it better than we will.
Plus, if we got involved, it might start World War III.
Well, that's quite a big caveat.
Yeah. I think just sorry to quickly clarify. I do think that we can support international institutions and uphold what is right and what has been laid down in international law and convention. But I think that we should be very careful that we follow those rules as well. I think Iraq was an historic mistake, and the idea of nation building or simply imposing democracy in our way on other countries, it showed to have failed, and it undermined our moral authority. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about these protests in Iran and how women are treated there, but I think we should just be careful not to rush into reckless action, especially action that doesn't that disregards maybe the sovereignty of other nations.
Okay, I do have a serious point now, actually, which is that if we do make the decision to intervene in a country, we've got to give them the support after we've made the intervention for decades and decades to come. Otherwise, we risk facing the disaster which happened in Afghanistan recently.
Well, I just quickly on that, in Afghanistan, we invaded in 2001. We supported their government for 2 decades, and then we left. And in the matter of days, the people that we ousted took over. So our 20-year nation building project in Afghanistan was an abject failure. So I think, obviously, Afghanistan is known as the place where empires go to die or sort of crumble, the graveyard of empires. That's it. But I think that there is a truth, a wider truth, that nation building is incredibly difficult, a difficult process, and we should be sceptical that it can always work.
So different. The culture's so different. You can't possibly do that.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap up there for this point. But I just want to bring up on the fact that you could argue on Afghanistan that had the US and UK remained in Afghanistan for longer, then the country could have changed. I mean, obviously we don't know, but historically speaking, Germany certainly altered its thoughts when there were a lot of Western presence there. And also there is, of course, it's important to note when we're talking about countries and whether or not they should espouse our values, that we are friends or allies with countries that don't espouse Western values, such as Saudi Arabia, which also doesn't treat women in the way that we would hope, and they are considered allies. But we're going to move on now. Thank you very much for that section. We're going to be playing a song that's Forgive and Forget Major. We just had a message on. Everyone knows, obviously, that Titus is a big fan of John Major after the Prime Minister special. Okay, we're going to have a song now, and this has been requested by Amy, who's listening at home, and she has requested Escape. So enjoy.
On campus.
And online.
Check it out.
This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We're live on University Radio Nottingham with me, Felix Hawes. We were just talking over the break there, whilst you were listening to the music, about the bravery of these women in Iran who are protesting. And if you want to know more, do follow the BBC. They are doing a lot of reporting on this, and it's a very scary time for a lot of people. And the bravery to stand up for something you believe in against a totalitarian regime is something that's very worthy. And so we all collectively wish these women, the women of Iran, the best in the times ahead. So our third topic is actually about broadcasting, because it is GB News. GB News was set up, I think, over a year ago now as the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. And John Cleese of Monty Python fame, who I suppose our younger listeners might not actually know who John Cleese is. He was in Monty Python, a very successful comedy show from the 70s and 80s, and he was in Fawlty Towers, which is regularly voted the best comedy the BBC has ever produced. And more recently, he would be known for playing Nearly Headless Nick in Harry Potter and the voice of the King in Shrek, of course. But now he's on GB News, which he previously called KGB News because he thought it was funded by Russia. But this all links to free speech, because he said on the BBC itself, that he would be cancelled within 5 minutes of the BBC. So this is all about cancel culture. Well, Daniel, surely cancel culture doesn't exist for John Cleese, at least, if he's managed to get a job on GB News.
No, I entirely disagree with that. John Cleese, I mean, if you look at his career, I mean, just recently, I think the turmoil that he got into when he said that London isn't really an English city anymore, you can tell that, yes, in the 70s he was considered a bit of a leftish guy attacking the conservative establishment, but now he's on the right because he's rocketing on about free speech, and so it's entirely unsurprising, really, that he's decided to go for GB News, frankly the best television channel available.
No paid promotion on URN. Daniel is not being paid.
Well, quite often it's a good channel. So no, I think it's great that he's moved over there.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because John Cleese in the 1970s got into a lot of trouble for his free speech views against the church with the creation of the making of Life of Brian, and now, from his point of view, he sort of sees what was the dominance of Christianity in the UK silencing people, the censorship. It is now what is commonly referred to, at least in political circles. I'm not sure it's a very well-known term outside of that, but the woke agenda. Josh and Titus, what do you think of this free speech and John Cleese?
Okay, so this winds me up because John Cleese goes on the BBC, an irony he seems to have missed, to talk about his no platforming when he was given like a good 20 minutes on Radio 4 to discuss this stuff. Then, it just winds me up, Felix. It just does. As like no one would care about John Cleese if it wasn't for the BBC in the first place. And Graham Norton came out, I think, the past few days and said something really interesting, that it's not a lack of free speech, it's just free speech with accountability. And frankly, I don't think people are stopping him from saying what he wants to say. I think they're holding him accountable. That's all.
I think the question of accountability is an interesting one, though, because obviously the next question is then, what is it that people ought to be held account for? So I think what John Cleese might be pointing out is that what is acceptable to say has changed, and he believes what he is saying is still a legitimate view, but he feels that many people are now saying that's not acceptable. And it's not that he's not been allowed to speak, but he is being challenged in a way that is beyond just debate or the discussion of ideas. He is being discouraged from saying what he really thinks by people at the BBC, by that sort of culture that they have in places like the BBC, from airing what he believes are legitimate views. And so he's saying the window of acceptable views that people are happy to discuss has changed. And obviously the BBC are having him on. They have impartiality rules, and he's famous for his acting, and so he's also on there because of his acting, not his political views. But he's saying that he is no longer that is no longer smiled upon, and it's harder to say that. And some people ordinary people will see that by being cancelled, i.e. losing their job, social ostracisation, things like that. But with someone of John Cleese's profile, it's not going to be a proper cancel, so to speak. But he feels like he is being unduly attacked for what are legitimate views, and then he goes to GB News, which he obviously previously didn't think very highly of, and he said that they were perfectly nice to him, and he would be able to share views which maybe more people aren't comfortable hearing but are still legitimate, or just aren't as fashionable, and now people will respond to quite harshly and not give the space for in mainstream or more established programs.
Titus, you sort of hit the nail on the head here. Is what is acceptable to say and what isn't acceptable to say depends on who you are. Some people will think that what John Cleese is saying, Daniel mentioned his comments about London not being an English city, is completely offensive and he shouldn't be allowed to say something like that. Other people might think, it's a bit offensive, but he should be allowed to say it. It just depends where your line is. I mean, recently Kanye West has been removed from Twitter because he said something anti-Semitic. And a lot of people say, that is acceptable, but other people would say, well, Donald Trump shouldn't be banned from Twitter. Other people would say that he should. So it's very much what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. This idea of, I think you've described cancellation pretty well, what it actually means, because people obviously do still have platforms. J.K. Rowling is one of the most prominent people that is so-called cancelled, but we still hear what J.K. Rowling has to say. But there is also the case that she wasn't invited to the 20th anniversary of a film series of which she was the creator of. And there are obviously issues going on there in terms, if you deem it an issue about people having being deplatformed for views. I mean, some people will think that J.K. Rowling not being invited was exactly the right thing to do. Other people will think that although they disagree with her views, she should be invited, and other people will of course agree with her. And it's these blurred lines, and I'd love to talk about this more, and we have talked about free speech before, but we are unfortunately now at the end of our time here today on this very fine Saturday. But before I go, I just wanted to read some more comments from our messaging platform. During our song Escape that Amy requested, there was a message that was, is it an African or a European swallow? And more recently we've had, I believe this came after I said that John Cleese was voicing the King in Shrek, that the Queen was really holding us all together, wasn't she? And she was indeed, and we do miss Her Majesty very much. But that is all we have time for. I just wanted to shout out to our regular listeners, George Scotland's aunt, my parents, and our new listeners, Lucy, Amy, James, Ollie, and of course my really close friend, Simon. Thank you very much for listening. And I would like to thank Titus, Josh, and Daniel for coming on today. We'll be back next week at 5 o'clock, our new time on Saturday. This has been The Big Picture on University Radio Nottingham with me, Felix Hawes. And to play us out is a classic. John Cleese is back on television. He's back for good.